Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Induction for Elected Members and Reform Update. This is a webinar by the Local Government Industry Regulation and Safety Department. So we welcome you all this afternoon to our webinar. Thank you for taking the time out of your afternoon to hear our updates and hearing from us. So before we start, I'd like to give an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation of where we're meeting today and facilitating this webinar. The Department of Local Government, Industry Regulation and Safety respectfully acknowledges Aboriginal people as being the traditional custodians of Western Australia, and we acknowledge the enduring connection to Aboriginal people to continue to share with the land, sea and sky through both their ancestral ties and custodianship to country, and also just acknowledging everyone that's joining our webinar today and acknowledging your elders past and present. And also, I'd like to acknowledge the value brought to our department through the collective contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across WA. So before we jump into the presentation today, I'd like to introduce who's at the table with me. So I'll start with Cam.
Hi everyone, my name's Cameron Taylor. I'm the Acting Director of Regulatory Reform, Local Government.
Hi everyone, Laura Hunter, Acting Executive Director, Local Government in the Support and Compliance area.
Hi everyone, I'm Ethan Redshaw, Acting Executive Director, Local Government, Legislation and Projects.
Hi everybody, Matthew Holliday, the Manager of Stakeholder Engagement for Local Government.
And today's webinar touches on a few different issues. So the first will be the role of the department, as well as being an elected member. We'll also talk about the new Local Government Inspector and the compliance framework for local government. Also an update on regulatory reforms, and we'll have some resources and contacts as well for your information. Now, if you do have questions during this webinar, there's a Q&A function that you can use in Teams. Please submit via the Teams Q&A ahead of the Q&A session. At the end of this webinar, we'll have that Q&A session and we'll read out those questions and go through that. So just encourage you, if you do have any questions throughout the session, just post them into the Q&A function and we'll read them at the end. So the role of the department, and I'll hand to Laura Hunter to talk about this.
Thanks, Ethan. So the Department of Local Government Industry Regulation and Safety, also known as LGIS, was established on the 1st of July this year as part of the state government's public sector reform. Previously, the local government portfolio sat with the Department of Local Government Sport and Cultural Industries, which is now known as the Department of Creative Industries, Tourism and Sport. The vision for LGIS is to support a safe, fair and resilient economy where Western Australian industries, workers, consumers and communities thrive. So essentially, LGIS comprises of 5 groups arranged to deliver an efficient and effective service to our stakeholders. So alongside us, we have corporate services and labour relations, consumer protection and legal services, building, energy safety and service delivery and WorkSafe, and the local government area and the racing, gaming and liquor area. So LGIS regulatory approach is to support and regulate WA local governments using a capability and risk-based approach where oversight, support and intervention efforts are targeted based on analysis of greatest risks and informed by relevant legislation and an understanding of the challenges that local governments experience. Now, this is our current regulatory approach, noting that from January next year, with the introduction of the inspector, that will shift slightly, and Ethan will talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the inspector and the reforms later on in the presentation. So just to give you a bit of information about the structure of the local government directorate within the department. So in my area, the support and compliance area, we have the Director Local Government Support and Engagement and the team that sits underneath that. That area has the local government hotline where you can call through and ask any questions about governance and legislation related matters. We have the Investigations and Assessments Unit, which deals with looking at minor breaches and serious breaches. Again, that will slightly shift with the introduction of the inspector. The Financial Policy and Statutory Approvals area, which is involved in assessing a lot of the applications that you'll put forward as a local government, and Project Delivery, which has a function in relation to off-road vehicles, administering the legislation and supporting the Minister with that, and also delivery of election commitments that sit within the local government portfolio. Now I'll hand over to Ethan to explain the areas that he's responsible for.
Thanks, Laura. So I have 3 main areas underneath my portfolio. So this is the PETS WA team, as well as the regulatory reform team, which I've got Cam, my acting director, from that area, as well as a policy and legislation team. So, and there's a bit of a summary of the teams and what they do. The PETS WA project team, that's focused on the delivery of the Stop Puppy Farming commitments and the ICT build relating to PETS WA. The policy and legislation team deal with a range of different legislation. For example, you may have heard of CAT Act amendments being announced. That team is responsible for delivery of that and a range of other legislation. And Cam's area, Cam will speak a bit more about this today, but he focuses on Local Government Act reforms, in particular rolling out the reforms from the 2024 and 2023 local government amendment bills.
Thanks, Ethan. I think the slide's frozen. Okay, well, I'll keep talking while we're working that out. The next slide that we were going to talk through is just the key priorities for the Local Government Directorate. And they are local government reform, early intervention, improving communication and guidance for the sector, the financial policy and accounting help desk to provide local governments with support in that space, breach complaint processing, providing advice to the sector, and the Stop Puppy Farming that Ethan mentioned earlier.
There we go. I think we've got the slides back. So next slide. Face nuts. No, we're having some technical issues, so bear with us while we get to the next slide.
Okay, well, I'll start talking to that now. So the department is just one of many government agencies that have a role to play in the local government space, and we work alongside a lot of other agencies and may redirect queries accordingly, or they may be the more appropriate department depending on the matters that you have to deal with. So, for example, we work alongside the Public Sector Commission, which deals with complaints of minor misconduct, the Corruption and Crime Commission, which deals with serious misconduct, the Office of the Auditor General, which obviously has the oversight over audits, the WA Electoral Commission, responsible for running the recent local government elections, as you would be aware, WorkSafe, which conducts investigations into systems within local governments and deals with that psychologically safe workplaces, the Ombudsman for dealing with administrative matters, and the Salaries and Allowances Tribunal, responsible for setting salaries and allowances. And then relevant legislation. So the local government portfolio is responsible for administering a range of legislation. I think there's about 10 different acts that you can see up on the screen there, and then a large suite of regulations that sit underneath these. So as you can see, they range from the Cemeteries Act through to the Dog Act, and also in relation to local government grants. So we've got some statutory authorities underneath there that you can see, the Metropolitan Cemeteries Board and the WA Local Government Grants Commission. So we publish local government operational guidelines on various topics to assist with understanding the requirements of these legislation. There are also some other key legislation that are not administered by the local government division, but intersect with the work that local governments do, including the Planning and Development Act, the Planning and Development Regulations, the Building Act, and the Health Miscellaneous Provisions Act. So we now move on to being an elected member. So in terms of the role of council, this is set out in section 2.712 of the Local Government Act. And these responsibilities that are outlined on the slide here are taken directly from the Act. So the council is responsible for governing the local government's affairs, and as the local government's governing body, is responsible for the performance of the local government's functions. This includes overseeing the allocation of the local government's finances and resources, determining the local government's policies, planning strategically for the future of the district, determining the services and facilities to be provided by the local government in the district, selecting the CEO and reviewing the CEO's performance, and providing strategic direction to the CEO. So council must have regard to the following principles. Council's governing role is separate from the CEO's executive role, and it's important that council respects that separation. On the right of the slide here, you can see the continuum and some of the different responsibilities, with the purple showing the responsibilities of the local government staff within the administration, and also specifically the responsibilities of the CEO, and then the responsibilities of council members and how they all play within that continuum. And it's important to understand each of those responsibilities and how they contribute to one another. Essential skills for council members. So deliberation, facilitation and assisting constructive discussions to help achieve well-informed decisions. The ability to exercise independent consideration and judgment when voting, but to respect council decisions once they're adopted. The ability to build and sustain strong collaborative working relationships, and importantly, respecting the differences of others and working together to resolve any conflicts. The commitment to the role as a councillor. It's important to understand and comply with the council's code of conduct. Have the meeting attendance, so committing to attending those meetings, taking the time to review agenda papers and prepare in advance of meetings, obviously voting during council meetings, building community connections through networking and engagement, and completing the mandatory training modules within 12 months of commencing. And then finally, participating in training and professional development opportunities throughout the tenure of the role. I'll now hand back over to Ethan to talk through the new inspector and compliance framework.
Thanks, Laura. So in terms of the new inspector and the compliance framework, there's an overview here on this slide about the different roles and how they relate. So to summarise, the Governor of Western Australia is responsible for appointing the local government inspector, and that local government inspector manages inspectorate officers, which is essentially the office of the local government inspector. You'll see here that the local government division, which everyone at this table here is a part of, we report to the Director General of the department, LGs, and the Director General reports to the Minister for Local Government. So the Governor is also responsible for appointing the Minister. So you can see that relationship. And in terms of an employing authority, the LGs, the Director General, is responsible for employing the inspectorate officers, but the day-to-day management and responsibility of reporting, inspectorate officers report to the inspector. And you'll see here in this diagram, we also have adjudicators. They are the replacement for the current local government standards panel, which I'll describe in just a bit more detail in the coming slides. And the Minister for Local Government is responsible for appointing adjudicators. And just noting as well the separation between adjudicators who decide penalties and sanctions, and the Local Government Inspector's Office, who's responsible for the investigative function of the compliance framework. So again, I think I have a technical issue, so bear with me while I get the next slide up. But very recently, Mr. Tony Brown has been appointed by the Governor as the inaugural Local Government Inspector for Western Australia. And Mr. Brown's appointment is for 5 years and commenced recently on the 20th of October. So the Inspector's Office is planned to begin accepting complaints and exercising powers from the 1st of January 2026. So the Inspector's functions, and this is a summary of the functions from the legislation, is to receive and deal with complaints, conduct investigations, including investigations that are initiated by the Inspector himself, monitoring the conduct of local government's operations and affairs, providing education and information to assist in compliance and conduct, analysing systems and information, consulting, providing information and making recommendations. And that includes to local governments, but also to other agencies and to the department in relation to how we work. And if necessary, conducting an inspector's inquiry, which is the replacement to the current authorised inquiry. So a lot of this is technical information. You might not have all the context. So this is almost a starting sort of slide to explain what the inspector will be doing. This is also just giving you a high level overview of what types of breaches we have under the Local Government Act. There are 4 main types of breaches. These are behavioural breaches, conduct breaches, recurrent breaches and specified breaches. And these will be the new terminology from the 1st of January 2026 when the Inspector's Office commences. So a behavioural breach is dealt with at the local government level under the Local Government's Code of Conduct. A conduct breach, and those who might be familiar already with the standards panel process, is currently called a minor breach. The inspector will be responsible for complaint receipt and investigation. They either dismiss the complaint or accept the complaint, and if they do accept the complaint, it's referred to an adjudicator for a decision. So a preliminary investigation is what the inspector does in relation to a conduct breach. A recurrent breach is when the inspector receives a conduct breach that has 2 previous conduct breaches that have been found. That can be escalated as a specified breach. And a specified breach, with those who may be familiar with the current system, is the new name of a serious breach, and it means committing a prescribed offence under the Local Government Act. So again, the inspector is responsible for complaint receipt and investigation, and they dismiss or accept the complaint. However, for this type of complaint, the inspector, if they accept the complaint, they can make an allegation to the State Administrative Tribunal, or they can initiate a prosecution in court. Or if it is an infringible offence, they can take other action through their office, such as issuing an infringement notice. So that's just a high level summary of the breaches. There is a lot more information on our website about the inspector. As well, the inspector will have a website once the office launches with all this information about complaints and breaches. So just a bit more information about the differences between the Inspector's Office and the current ways that we work in the department. So the Inspector's Office will be separate from the department's local government division, as you saw in that other diagram. The inspector is accountable as a public officer, so they're independent public officer, that they are accountable to the Minister, the Corruption and Crime Commission, the Public Sector Commission, the Auditor General and the Ombudsman, and also the Parliament. So they must prepare an annual report that is tabled in Parliament each year. However, to safeguard the inspector's independence from, in particular, the Minister and other people who may direct the inspector, a minister's direction cannot target a particular person or a particular complaint. So while they do report to the Minister, there are those safeguards to their independence. So next steps with this, we're currently actively in a change process around the Inspector's Office. So this month, CAM and the regulations team are working on the development and consultation with what we currently have as a regulations working group to go through regulations. By the end of December, minor breaches will be dealt with by the standards panel up until that date. But going forward from the 1st of January, conduct breaches will go to adjudicators through the local government inspector, and relevant sections of the Local Government Amendment Act will be commenced. So there are a lot of changes happening over the next 2 months. So we just encourage those to be aware of LG alerts and other information that are coming out about updates around the local government inspector. So in terms of local government inspector, that's sort of the high level update, but I will pass on to Cam now to talk more in detail about other regulatory reforms.
Great, thanks, Ethan. So just to provide some high-level context for, in particular, new councillors, back to the Act review or the Act reforms, Local Government Act reforms, date back to the genesis of these amendments, which goes back to the 2017 when the McGowan government decided to take a review of the Local Government Act, which is enormous. It's if anyone has any familiarity with it, it's over 500 pages, and there's a number of sets of regulations that sit underneath the Local Government Act. So to implement the changes that came about as a result of consultation back in 2022, I believe.
That's right.
We split them into 2 tranches. So essentially there was 2 bills that were introduced to Parliament, the 2023 Local Government Amendment Act, and then more recently last year's Local Government Amendment Act 2024. So for the purposes of explaining these changes, I'll refer to them as the 23 and the 24 Amendment Acts. And they introduced a raft of changes, some of which have been commenced and some of which are yet to be commenced because they're largely associated with regulations for implementation. So the 2023 Amendment Act largely dealt with electoral reforms, including the introduction of optional preferential voting. So that has now been in effect for 2 local government elections, and it also introduced other concepts such as backfilling extraordinary vacancies, where the next place candidate on the ballot paper may be instated, well, basically is elected to the position, to a vacancy in the event that a council member resigns, for example. The 2024 Act has introduced a number of other reforms, some of which are on the screen here, including as Laura had alluded to, clarifying roles and responsibilities, the introduction of the local government inspector, which also includes the ability to appoint monitors to deal with early intervention. The ability to pay council members superannuation was also introduced by the 2024 Amendment Act, and that is now in effect. Increases to various penalties across the Act were also introduced. They were all quite out of date, and they've been increased to align with other penalties in other legislation and inflation. And there's some other additional policy requirements for rates and for example, a rates and revenue policy, which is still a work in progress with regulations. New requirements for audit committees, which will expand their role and their scope, and I'll talk about the regulations related to those shortly. Resource sharing provisions, streamlining provisions and processes for model local laws, and some provisions that relate to a greater flexibility for regional subsidiaries, which may not mean a lot to newly elected members, but in time you'll come to be familiar with what these various reforms relate to. Next slide. Okay, I can keep talking. So I'll just continue on until we get the slide back, but as I mentioned, there's a number of regulations projects that have fallen out of both the Amendment Acts. For the purposes of 2025, our priority regulations that are working with at the moment are in relation to the new requirements for audit committees and audit risk and improvement committees. And the other priority set of regulations are to do with the implementation of the local government inspector, which Ethan has also alluded to. This slide is referring to sort of the status of where these various projects are at currently. So the rates and revenue policy is associated with reforms for council planning. There has been a working group established, which I've been chairing, which deals with the implementation of this and the reforms for council planning. So these are all a work in progress and are informed by the input from the stakeholders that are represented on that working group. Other sets of regulations that we have in progress as well are regulations that deal with standardising meeting procedures, and that there is further consultation planned. There has been initial consultation to get the regulations to this point back in 2024, and there will be further regulations planned. As Ethan alluded to, recently there was a working group established, the regulations working group, which is comprised of key stakeholders, which I think is also on another slide upcoming. I'll go into greater detail, but they'll have opportunity as well to provide feedback on these and other regulations. As mentioned, the IPR reforms, which is to do with the council planning, communications agreements, which initially it was anticipated that we would have, and we had consulted on draft regulations for these, I might add, earlier this year, and it was anticipated that we would have these in place following the October 18 elections. However, due to competing priorities, these are still a work in progress. So in the interim, we've been advising local governments who've been inquiring about the status of these regulations that they can continue to implement their own communications by agreements in the interim period. Other regulations that we've consulted on to date include regulations dealing with the publication of CO key performance indicators and requirements for registers to be published online, which are also a work in progress. And feedback has been taken into consideration as part of the next stage in developing these regulations further.
And Ken, just while we're on this slide, I thought I'd mention a lot of the questions that we do get around regulations is the timing in particular and knowing when things are coming. We do give our best indications around when we're targeting particular timeframes for reform. However, the drafting process is quite iterative and it takes some time to feed the input of the consultation processes back to the drafting process. So just a bit of information, the department isn't responsible for drafting or writing legislation. We instruct on legislation and Parliamentary Council's office is responsible for writing the law, writing the legislation. So it is a process that can take some time. But what we do strive to do is, first of all, give a lot of warning before we do implement changes. And we do have transition periods to make sure that it's easier for the sector to plan for the changes in a way that isn't essentially introducing something without warning. So we just really strive to give enough warning through our webinars that we hold. The other sort of aspect is as well the regulations working group. I think Ken will mention that that's really critical to getting really good practical feedback from our sector. So I'll hand it back to Ken to talk about the regulations working group.
No, thanks, Ethan. There, very good points that you make as well. Which brings us to the topic of the regulations working group. So the purpose of the group is to review consultation drafts of regulations, and it provides an opportunity for sector involvement and for also to get the feedback of people with practical experience in dealing with some of these issues in the field. The working group, basically the working group comprised of standing nominees provided by WALGA and local government professionals, and there is opportunity for additional representatives to be added to working group meetings based on the subject matter of the regulations that are under review. And representatives may include elected members, staff, or other subject matter experts that are relevant to the particular topic.
And we've had 3 working group meetings so far on the audit risk and improvement committees, as well as 2 meetings on the inspector regulations, and really appreciate all the sector feedback through those representatives so far. But like Cam mentioned, all those sets of regulations that we are working on go through that regulations working group.
This brings us to the changes for the audit committee regulations, which are imminent. I guess this is probably more for the purposes of, or it's for the purposes of everyone, but some of the administration staff in particular that have had some queries about how this will be implemented. So at a high level, I'll touch on what the new requirements of for audit committees are going to require once the relevant sections of the 2024 Amendment Act are commenced and the regulations are made, which will occur concurrently at the same time. So an ARIC will require an independent presiding member. This is a significant change, the chair. It will also require an independent deputy of the presiding member, which will be the deputy chair, to act in the chairperson's absence. There is some intersection with the current requirements for committees. So this leads me to the next point, that an ARIC may choose, or an ARIC may choose to appoint a deputy presiding member. Some of the terminology is a little bit confusing, I will acknowledge, in the Act, but the the deputy person, if appointed, must be independent and cannot be the same person as the deputy member. So I guess the key points to reiterate here are that the changes are that an audit committee in future will have to have an independent presiding member and an independent deputy of that presiding member to act in their absence. There is the ability to appoint another deputy to act in to appoint to the committee, but that person, if appointed, must also be an independent person. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Ethan, to help clarify. But
I think just sort of mentioning as well that you can currently appoint independent members to your audit committees. And so the department, as part of the transitional for these regulations, is looking at how best to support those who may already have done these appointments for an independent presiding member and also the independent deputy of that member to ensure a smoother transition. But I think maybe the next
the graphic probably provides a much easier explanation of things.
And in particular, seeing that on the right-hand side, the independent deputy presiding member is optional. However, in the blue and in the lighter purple, both of those independent presiding members are requirements for the Audit Risk and Improvement Committee going forward. And there's also other members that may be council members. And I think the only thing I'd sort of ask Cam is, well, what's an independent member? Just for those, I think it's,
well, an independent member is not a council member or
of any council,
of any council, or an employee of the particular local government. Probably the key factor. So, and I suppose we're talking about, to take a step back, we're talking about some of the technical requirements here around membership. At a much higher level, this is about having the government's reform is aimed at having a level of independent oversight, which is ultimately what this reform is about. And at a practical level, it relates to the appointment of these particular members.
And I think just because we have had a lot of queries on this, we thought it would be helpful just to go over that a bit more in this presentation, especially since it is coming up as part of regulations in the near future.
Yeah, the other thing to say is that there will be additional guidance on this once the regulations are made and the relevant sections commenced, and that there is also a period, transitional period built into the Act to enable local governments to transition from an audit committee to an audit risk and improvement committee. But I know that we have provided a lot of feedback to our local governments who've inquired to Act Review about how this may work going forward. And as is the case currently, local governments may appoint independent members ahead of the changes in anticipation that these new requirements are imminent.
Thanks for that, Ken. And moving on to resources and contacts. So our local government reforms and information, and a lot of this information about audit risk and improvement committees and in the inspector, we do have dedicated fact sheets and information papers on our website. LGIS does hold webinars regularly as well to highlight key reform updates. So I would encourage you to register for LG Alerts if you haven't already, in order to receive the notifications when we do have these webinars. We like to do webinars every time we are introducing or rolling out updates for reforms, in particular regulations reforms. We also do put recordings of previous webinars on our website, so you can look back on previous webinars to see the information on particular topics that you might be interested in. So in terms of the contact for Laura and myself, we do encourage you to use the local government at lgs.wa.gov.au email address. Sometimes we do find, although we do have our distinct portfolios and areas, that we need to work together on certain queries. So we do encourage you to send to that email address, and that will allow us to triage any queries that might come through. We also have a local government hotline, and that's used for local government staff or elected members who may have queries. And that's a really direct contact to us at the department. If you do have any quick questions, we'd encourage you to call the hotline or use the email address that's on the screen. We also do have a financial policy and statutory approvals team under Laura's area, and that's legislation at Algiers. That team is really there to answer any questions you might have about statutory approval processes. They do also do financial policy, so just giving that contact. And as we have previously mentioned, the Act Review at Algiers is CAM's mailbox essentially for reform queries about local government Act Review and also regulatory reform. So if you do have any more particular questions that are around active reform matters, that's the best contact for us. We also do accept suggestions around reform, anything you might notice when you're reviewing legislation and trying to understand the legislation. Feel free to use that as a touch point for that team. So now we've gotten to the end of the presentation. Thanks everyone for your time. We will go into a Q&A session now. You can still submit via the Q&A function. If you don't have access to the Q&A function, feel free to email us at Act Review. But I would encourage those who do have access to Teams to use that function. And we will start by handing over to Matt to start us off.
Thank you. So the first question is, will the webinar recording be provided to participants for reference?
Yes, so we will post this up on our website like other reform webinars. We also do provide a PDF of the slides to all participants, and we'll send that out in the coming days to everyone, so you do have a reference point. Some of the things you would have seen in the slides are hyperlinked text to our website, so you'll be able to click through to those links once you have that PDF copy.
Thank you. And then I've got a question here about ARIC that we just discussed. And is with respect to ARIC presiding and deputy presiding independent members, will these individuals be entitled to reimbursement for their time and attendance?
Yes. So that's a really good question. Independent members do have a entitlement to be paid as committee members. That information is through the Salaries and Allowances Tribunal determination. So existing independent members, if they're already appointed, can be paid. And more information on that is on our website, but also on the Salaries and Allowances Tribunal determination for local governments.
That's everything so far.
Excellent. So encourage anyone who hasn't already asked a question, feel free to submit in the next couple of seconds. If not, I might ask Cam to check our mailbox to see if anything's come through.
Yeah.
Can we please provide some information about the mandatory training that is required in the next 12 months?
Yes, that's a good question about that. So the Local Government Essentials training, we'll get more information for participants for this webinar, and we'll provide some information when we do email out these slides around how you can get more information on who delivers that training, as well as the requirements around that.
There's no additional questions in the Act Review inbox at this stage.
Excellent. So unless, Matt, you've got anyone else coming through,
That's it.
we'd just like to thank everyone for your time this afternoon. Really pleased to welcome you all as new incoming council members or re-elected council members and those staff that are supporting. So really appreciate everyone's time in this webinar. And yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.